tardes. Mi nombre es Luis Alberto Pineda, soy investigador del Departamento de Ciencias de la Computación de aquí de Limas. Y me da mucho gusto presentarles al doctor Tom Frost, quien fue investigador en nuestro departamento por varios años. Tom se apareció por aquí en el 2012. 2012. Y estuvo aquí como
7 años.
7 años en Limas. Y pues, durante 3 años, Tom empezó a desarrollar sus ideas. Bueno, ya venía con muchos sus ideas en activismo y esos movimientos. Y aquí durante su estancia tuvimos un diálogo continuo y una interacción cotidiana, muchas veces con mucha energía, acerca de la inteligencia artificial, tanto desde el punto de vista de sus aspectos prácticos como desde el punto de vista de la filosofía de la computación y de su relación con otras disciplinas que no son computacionales. Entonces, tuvimos aquí esa gran experiencia de tener a Tom, fue muy motivante, y pues desafortunadamente por ahí del 2018, 19, se fue a Japón, lo lamentamos mucho, y hemos, digamos, y lo extrañamos por toda la vida que él generó, la estancia aquí, genera seguramente en Japón. Y pues realmente nos da mucho gusto tener la oportunidad de recibirlo hoy para hablar de este tópico que es objeto de análisis y debate y crítica de gran intensidad. Y pues nos da mucho gusto escuchar cuál es la visión que tiene Tom actualmente acerca de esta semana. Y pues sin más, salud.
Muchas gracias, Luis, por esta introducción. Me animó mucho regresar aquí al IMAS, en donde crecieron muchas de esas ideas en interacción con ustedes. Y pues quiero regresar a esos temas y hacer un update. I'm going to do it in English. It's been 5 years. So, yesterday we had a first lecture which was about artificial intelligence. I'm sorry, Luis, that today the switch will be to natural minds rather than artificial minds. But I think you will recognize a lot of the topics of our discussions. So, then let me start. So I should say that the funding for this comes from the Japanese Science and Technology Agency. And just to kind of like give the background motivation of how this is related, talking with all the natural scientists at OIST, where I'm based, questions of health are quite difficult for the natural sciences to deal with. Okay, and this will be to some extent, the background motivation for today's talk is how do you tell whether something is going well or something is going bad, let's say, if all you have are matters of fact, or even worse, just numbers, okay? I can measure things. I can tell you, well, let's say the diversity of this ecosystem is 7.5 according to my metric. Well, is that good or bad? And if it's bad, then what should I do about it? Those questions can't be directly derived from the natural sciences themselves. They require a broader framework. But what is that broader framework and how does it interface with the natural sciences? That's a big, tall question, right? And I'm going to try to take some small steps towards an answer in the context of cognitive science. So this is the unit I created at OIST. A continuation of the unit that I had here at IMAS, which was the 4E cognition group. It's called the Embodied Cognitive Science unit. And the main idea is that in order to understand the human mind as a natural phenomenon, we have to understand it as a process of interaction that spans various scales. Okay, so it's about intelligent action in the world, which obviously involves the brain. So we've got a lot of brain imaging equipment in our unit. But the brain is just one organ of the human organism. And so we're also looking at all the other systems, not all the others, a few other systems of the human body and how they're related with the brain and with the mind. But our interactions don't happen into the middle of nowhere. They're in a context. And especially in the human mind case, that's an essential component of what enables our higher level capacities. So we need to look at our ecological context, social context, cultural context, the technologies that we use, and all of these together will shape how we think and interact with the world. So, as I mentioned yesterday, that to some extent means that in order to do cognitive science well, we need to do all the sciences well. And that's a really hard task, right? We need to say something about the body, maybe going all the way from the chemistry and thermodynamics of metabolism up to the biology of the body, the psychology of the mind, the social context of the mind, the cultural context, so we can bring in all the humanities. So we're basically going from physics to humanities and everything in between. And that's what we need to do if we want to get a complete picture of the basis of the human mind. So to study the human mind basically means you have to study everything, which is tough, right? And so in our units, we try to approximate some of that. And so we've got physicists, we've got biologists, philosophers, people working with technologies, engineers, computer scientists, neuroscientists. And one of the things that, it's just a kind of like take-home message from working in that kind of context for the last 5 years is it's so hard to find the right language. Okay, how do we speak with each other? And this is a general problem. It's not just for cognitive science, but for the sciences in general. And in fact, at OIST, one of the reasons for its creation is as a counterweight to the increasing specialization of the sciences. So if you open up a copy of Nature magazine, and you might be a specialist in one discipline, how many of the other contributions can you actually properly understand? Probably very few, right? Which means that even if I read that article, I will not be able to tell whether it's good or bad or whether it makes sense. I just don't even have the language. The concepts will be, not even the title makes sense, right? It'll be like CDX that does this kind of thing. And it's like, what, right? So this kind of Tower of Babel was important for a long time, but now the future of the sciences really depends on integrating across these kinds of silos, because ultimately what we're studying is one phenomenon, which is reality, right? So actually, technically, we should be able to integrate everything together somehow. Okay, so OIST was created with no departments, there's no disciplinary boundaries, there's only research groups, and they're all organized in a horizontal way in order to get people to talk again and to focus on the questions rather than disciplines. And so in our kind of microcosm of that world, units, one thing that we found is very helpful in this regard is respecting differences. And it's a kind of, in the philosophy of science, try to eradicate differences. You might think that the best thing to do in order to bridge across domains is to somehow put them all on a common denominator and say it's all the same thing, right? The mind is just the brain, for example, in the case of cognitive science, right? Or life is just about DNA, in the case of biology, right? So that's kind of like collapsing across domains, but usually that doesn't end up very productive, because the people who are, let's say, at the lower scale think that they don't need the higher scale, and the people at the higher scale basically are disenfranchised and create a different silo, right? So that's kind of the antithesis of integration. That's reductionism. That means that we're basically excluding dialogue. So what I'm going to propose today is that there are actually scientific ways of bridging that allow us to do something different, but without getting fuzzy about the way in which we relate across disciplinary boundaries. Let me introduce some differences that I think are worth respecting to get us started. I highly recommend this book. about the birth of consciousness. It's very easy to read, but it basically takes you from the origins of animals when we were tiny worms living in the mud, the bottom of the sea, to humans, but mainly looking at the phases of the early stages of life in the sea and what they meant for the mind and cognition. One distinction that comes out of this book is that when we talk about consciousness, it's useful to separate, on the one hand, agency, which is that when you're aware of things, you can do things differently. But of course, also you experience things as part of the awareness. You're aware of the world. But these two things are separate, and it's quite likely, according to the author of this book, that agency came first. Right? So first we evolved the capacity to do stuff, to behave, to move, to change our environment. And the capacity to reflect upon things and experience things came along a little bit later. So we'll get back to that distinction in a bit. Another useful guideline for respecting differences is this idea, what we call the participation criterion. We propose this here in the case of biology, where there's currently a lot of debate about agency and teleology and how do we get goal-directedness into our counts of behavior. And again, the problem is that most solutions for how to account for the fact that living systems seem to be goal-directed is to identify goals with something that are not goals. Let's say a particular kind of neural pattern in your brain. If you have this pattern in your brain, that means you're following a goal, right? Problem is, with this kind of move, you're not respecting differences. And you're opening the door to eliminativism, because if all you need is the pattern in your brain, then why talk about goals in the first place, right? You might have just say, you know, there's a pattern in the brain and it causes the behavior. Goals are just ways of talking, right? And so you basically exclude all of agency and teleology from the beginning. This participation criterion says, if you want to be serious about preserving all this diversity in which we can look at life, there needs to be a distinguishable difference about systems that have those capacities compared to none. Okay? And we have a specific proposal, which I will unpack, which is that the more you have other domains making a difference, the more physiologically unpredictable there will be the changes in the physiology. All right? So let's just give a kind of a quick intuitive look at what that could mean. Right? I move my arm right now, and I do it for a reason, because I want to make a point, right? So it's a rational, goal-directed action. Now, at the same time, of course, it's my organism, my body, and all the muscles and brain and so on that makes this possible. But to the extent that the arm is moving also because I wanted to make a point and I have a goal, to that extent, if I measured everything at the subpersonal level inside my body, there would be variability that cannot be explained in principle only by referring to what happens inside my body. Because we can't measure goals. You can't see reasons at that level, at that scale. So there should be some variability that remains unexplained, basically. All right, and that's for the agency. But for consciousness, it's similar. So this comes from Friston and his colleagues, who are very popular these days with their free energy principle. I have some concerns about their work, but in this case, we're on the same page, which is to say that for consciousness, right, when they call active states, if it doesn't make a difference to the world, well, then we would never even have any grounds for needing an explanation in the first place. Right? It would not be a scientific problem in that case, if it has no impact on the world, right? So for them, an epistemic argument suggests that no detectably consciousness system can lack active states. Or in other words, given that I see all of you aware of me presenting, then there should be a detectable difference at the level of what we can measure scientifically that separates you out from people who will be unconscious, basically. And that doesn't seem to be too drastic of a claim, but it's worth making it explicit. Now, we're going to go through a long phase of philosophy before I get to the results. So in order to keep people here happy who are not philosophers, let's just see where are we going with this. Okay, so here's a paper from Nature Neuroscience by some colleagues of ours, Pedro Mediano, Fernando Rosas, Daniel Bors, a few people that I've worked with. And so they did a huge analysis of public databases, and they looked at two kinds of informational states in the brain. One is redundant information, which basically means that you can get the same informational content from different sources. And another kind is what they call synergistic information, which means that there's novelty here, so some information creation is happening. And it turns out that these two different kinds of information are associated with different kinds of the brain, different parts of the brain with different kinds of tasks. And the redundant ones tend to be perceptual, sensory-motor kinds of processes, whereas the synergistic ones are associated with integration into higher complex cognitive forms. Okay, this is a data-driven approach, right? We've got different kinds of informational measures, and it turns out they pick up on different things. But we might ask, why is redundant information associated with perception, whereas this information creation is associated with complex cognition? Okay, that doesn't answer that question. So what we're going to do now is go through a bit of theorizing, and hopefully I'll show you that from a few simple premises, we can actually make this prediction a priori, like what kind of information will be associated with what kind of process. And we can measure it. So let's start with the philosophy. The mind-body problem, classic problem for cognitive science, but also for science in general. Famously, when Descartes launched the modern scientific project, he made a split in reality between the things that we could measure, objectively speaking, and subjective phenomena like consciousness. And that was genius because it got him all the church off his back. And they said, okay, well, we get the subjective stuff, you guys can do the objective stuff, right? So science was free to do its thing outside of ideological control. But of course, already at that time, people started wondering, well, if these are separate substances as he proposed, well, then how do they actually relate to each other? It's not that they were the first to ask these questions. These go back all the way to the Greeks and probably beyond. Question is, how am I, as a person, aware of things and doing things, somehow also at the same time a material body, just like this stuff and so on? It's fundamental existential questions, right? But at least here in the cognitive science context, we can distill out two particular aspects of this problem. One is, how does my mind make a difference to my behavior? Like I said, I can move my arm because I want to make a point. That's the problem of mental causation. And it's a hard problem because, again, like I said, when we look at the world, it seems like cause and effect. It's like billiard balls, right? It's just like there's stuff happening, causing other stuff happening. Never really see mind anywhere intervening and making things happen. So a lot of philosophers propose that we can solve this and still be realist about how mind makes a difference by just identifying it with the brain. You can make a good argument that mind is nothing but the brain. Well, we know the brain does stuff, so we solve the problem. At least that's one proposal. But even for people who are proposing that, they have another problem on their hands, which is the problem of consciousness. Okay, so we don't really have a good story at the moment for how is it possible that certain states of our brain or our body make all of our experiential life possible. No idea. Nobody knows, right? And that's a problem for the other guys because if I'm acting with response to an experience, like a feeling, an intuition, because it feels good, bad, whatever, well, then I also have to account for how it is possible that consciousness causes behavior. But given that we don't have account of consciousness, where it comes from, we don't have a full account of mental causation either. Okay, so these two problems are interlinked, and right now they're unsolved. That's for the human case, but we can generalize this. Okay, so for any talk of representational content, and this is for people who work with animals, for example, you might want to say that there's representational content in a mouse brain when it moves around a maze, and you can find a correlation between some neuron firing and some position in the maze. You say, oh yeah, there's the representational content of its spatial position, right? Something like that. Yet we have no good account of how to naturalize this notion of content. So when we measure things, all we have is, let's say, neural firing activity. And that's all. Electrical potentials. Chemistry moving around. It's no content. And so even if someone said, well, natural selection somehow made it happen, there will be some account of that, some explanation of that in the future, let's give them that and say, okay, let's leave the problem of orientational content, these neurons, we'll still have the other problem, which is how does that even make a difference? So if you look at the equations that we use to describe neuronal activity, like Hodgkin-Huxley's equations, there's no room for content. What would content be in such a mathematical model? So we get mental causation problem as well, generalized to efficacy in general. So how would anything mental enter that kind of description? We just don't know. Okay, fundamental issues. And yet you'll find people talking about representational content and how it shapes behavior all the time, right? Just open whatever Nature Neuroscience magazine, look at some animal study, and you will find people talking about representational content. All right, so let's crystallize out this issue a little bit more, okay? This is Thomas Fuchs, another colleague, has this nice book called In the Defense of the Human Being. And I think even for people like him who really want to define human existence strongly and against the reductionist program, we can't ignore the facts of the matter, okay? So it doesn't help us to be fuzzy in our thinking. So he says in this book, no matter how closely we examine the processes in the brain, they inevitably remain external or opaque to us. Nowhere does something like subjective experience emerge. We just don't see it there. When we open up the brain and look inside, it's not like we find a little guy inside saying, I have experiences, hey, hi, here. You know? It's just matter, organic, messy stuff. The level of human deliberations, reasons, motives, and intentions simply does not appear in the calculations of physical laws. Likewise, their effectiveness remains physically unobservable. And this is, it's a hard fact to grapple with. And being at OIST, being one of the few units working with people, and most other units are, let's say, low-level neurobiology units that come closest to us, realizing that they have absolutely no need to talk about any of these things, like deliberations, reasons, goals, when they do their work, is pretty sobering. You know, they will just talk about, I don't know, calcium flows. That's it. That's what they're interested in, calcium flows. The rat does something, oh my goodness, look, we can image how calcium changes in the astrocytes in their brain. That's very nihilistic, right? Is that really all we need in order to understand how animals behave, including ourselves? Yet, it seems like there might be an in-principle impossibility here, and we just have to accept it. This is Dan Hutto, someone else who's advancing the inactive approach, arguing against the possibility of ever solving the problem of consciousness in principle. He says you just have to accept that it cannot be done, ever. He says what is left out by adopting an exclusively physical view of things is the possibility of describing the character of the experience, the phenomenology problem, and the possibility of having an intelligible understanding of how experiences can be understood in such terms, the metaphysical problem. Can consciousness be made intelligible in terms of something else? I argue that it cannot, not even in principle. So every time we have a solution to these problems in which basically we redefine things and say, I'm interested in consciousness, but I'm now going to treat consciousness as if it's this particular neural pattern, and from now on I'm going to talk about this neural pattern, you've basically lost intelligibility. We don't understand what's that jump. okay? So these are two notions that I want to keep us in mind, okay? So we've got unobservability here, right? We've got unintelligibility here. So I think, these are the kind of clues for a different way of thinking about things. Just to add one more here, this is a famous philosopher of science, Karl Popper and Eccles, in their book, The Self and Its Brain, where they basically try to solve the problem of free will and the mind-body problem. You find this at the very preface of the book. They say, without pretending to be able to foresee future developments, both authors of this book think it improbable that the problem will ever be solved in the sense that we shall really understand this relation. So no intelligibility, okay? So they write a huge book on this, but from the beginning they say we will never understand. Now this is really odd for the Western mind trained in rationality, right? We're trained to think of the universe as rational at heart. The logos, right, of the ancient Greeks somehow. Just being in Japan, though, opens up a different way of thinking about it, and we could do the same for ancient Mesoamerica, actually. That'll be a whole nother talk, but they have similar ideas. This is not the only way of thinking about things. Here's a different way of thinking about things. In this little book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, the book opens talking about meditation posture, Zazen sitting posture. And Suzuki says, this is the most important teaching, not two and not one. Our body and mind are not two and not one. If you think your body and mind are two, like dualism, that is wrong. If you think that they are one, like materialism or physicalism, that is also wrong. Our body and mind are both two and one. Okay, non-binary logic. Now that's hard to grapple with, right? What does that mean, that our mind and body are not one and not two, and one and two, all at the same time? We have some precedents in Western tradition to think about these things. This is a famous painting by Escher, who explored, paradoxes of self-reference and fractals and things like that. So we can think of the scientific observer creating the scientific world image, just looking at it, right? But then strangely, if you move your gaze to the right hand of this picture and go down, you realize that actually he's inside the picture. It's not one, it's not two, okay? On the left-hand side, it's two, self and other or separate. On the right-hand side, it turns out they're one and the same. And there's a strange structural twist in the middle, which is hidden with the author's signature, right? That's where things become unintelligible. So this is just to show you, kind of like the state where things are. And now I will propose you the solution that, I propose as a way forward that takes into account all of these issues. And I call it eruption theory. And I will explain what I mean by that. The way this theory is designed is to basically go back to first principles. Imagine that we know nothing about how the brain or the body works. We start from the most intuitive premises and then see how far we can go. Axiom number 1, motivational efficacy. An agent's motivations, whatever they might be, your goals, desires, beliefs, experiences, right? As such, that means no substitutions, right? As such means as your goals, etc., make a difference to the material basis of your behavior. They make a difference to the behavior generation. Okay, so this, I think, is the most fundamental axioms of all, because if you disagree with this axiom, you've basically excluded yourself from the human life world. Like you can't talk with each other anymore. Because I assume that when you say things for reasons, that you're sensitive to arguments, right? So this is the foundation, Without this, science is impossible. So we have to accept this axiom, okay? But as we saw, things are not simple because our best sciences tell us that we don't have any evidence for axiom number 1. Okay, it's impossible to measure how motivations as such, as whatever motivations they are, make a difference to the material basis of behavior. It's kind of non-representational cognitive science. Like I said, if you measure what happens in your brain, we can look at the quantities of calcium or electrical potential or whatever we're interested in, but we'll never see your belief or your desire or your goal. It's just unobservable and unintelligible at that level of description. That sets up the foundational problem that a lot of books are dealing with at the moment. There's a big battle in this intellectual sphere of, are we determined or are we free agents? Right? That's where it's a very hot topic right now. Well, we can diffuse the situation a little bit by taking on another axiom, which is that behavior, actually any system's behavior, but also including agent behavior, is underdetermined by its material basis. That means there's noise in the system, stochasticity, irreducible uncertainty, indeterminacy. Okay, so that's already a fact of nature too, which means that this axiom here is not in direct tension anymore with axiom number 1. It only would be if it could give us a complete explanation. So if I could, in principle, give you 100% prediction of everything that you will do next, assuming some God-eye point of view, then that would indeed rule out axiom number 1, that you do things for reasons. Fortunately, it's not the case. Okay, axiom 3 basically says there are in principle reasons why science would never be able to predict whatever you do next 100% accuracy. So that's kind of, part of the overall debate. But here's the novel proposal. It goes one step further. I argue that the more an agent's embodied activity is motivated, the less that activity is determined by its material basis. There's an exclusion principle at work here. So the more axiom 1 kicks in, the less axiom 2 can hold, and vice versa. And that's what I'm going to try to unpack a little bit more. I call this eruption because from Latin, it's about rushing in, invading, breaking, and so on. So basically, the idea is that whenever you're motivationally involved in your behavior generation, you're breaking the tendencies of your body. Let's say the automatic physical tendencies that would have otherwise spontaneously filled the gaps. Now, this eruption thesis has been discussed in the past under libertarian accounts of free will, and then the response is always like, what good would it do if the only way I can be an agent that is sensitive to reasons if all my behavior is random, okay, stochastically flopping around? That doesn't help anyone, right? So I have to give an account that removes that problem, and I do that with a few extra theses. So first of all, I establish that the incompleteness that we find in terms of the organism do not necessarily come from the bottom level of nature, from quantum physics. They might do, but I don't actually think that's the most relevant indeterminism. I think we're actually finding here a genuinely inherent indeterminism at the scale of behavior generation. It's not coming from the quantum level. It's incomplete because it's self-referential. It's a whole nother lecture here, but basically living systems are very special because they're self-producing, right? So the material compounds that make up our bodies, all the proteins, wouldn't exist were it not for the processes of our body of synthesizing them. But those very processes depend for their existence on those compounds and wouldn't exist if it was not for those compounds, right? So that's why our bodies are generally self-creating materially all the time, continuously. Self-reference is a weird thing, okay? It's when logic breaks down and so on. So there is a possibility of making an argument here for incompleteness at the macro scale. If we still want to say that this indeterminism is at a very small scale, we might want to have an argument that the system, a living system, is poised to amplify those fluctuations to the level of where it matters for behavior. But even there, actually, we have already existing arguments, which is that life is at the edge of chaos. Okay, well, chaos, why should living bodies be chaotic? Well, that's one way of magnifying very, very small differences spontaneously. Okay, so it gives us an answer of why we might be organized in a chaotic way. And then finally, what would be the good of having macroscopically amplified waves of stochasticity going through your body? And here the idea is that our body is actually organized to take those perturbations and use them to do adaptive work. And I don't have time to go through all the details, but we have a whole simulation model of this, which basically shows that the flexibility and openness of your behavior depends on the system once in a while being pushed out of its attractors. Okay? Normal systems are very good falling into equilibria. It's their natural tendency. So actually what they need in order to become more versatile and flexible is something that pushes them out of those states. And that's to some extent the proposal here, that what we do with our mind when we interface with the body is opening those degrees of freedom which would otherwise be spontaneously closed off by the body. And we can push this all the way to the physical level. I'm going to skip that here. Maybe we can go back to later. But Schrödinger, famous quantum physicist, was banging his head against the mind-matter problem for most of his career after he got his Nobel Prize. And there's an interesting argument to be made that we could probably say new things about quantum physics and thermodynamics if we wanted to, based on this kind of framework. So here's then the proposal of how to solve these foundational problems we discussed about mental causation and conscious experience. If this is on the right track, what we've got in the case of mental causation is something that is unobservable. Okay, let's put on our neuroscience caps for a moment. Okay, we're neuroscientists, we're recording what's happening in your brain and so on. Okay, I cannot observe, if I look at that level, at that scale of description, what's going on in your mind. You can only observe what's happening with your neurons and all this stuff that's happening in the brain, right? So if your mind is actually causing your behavior, it's something I can't observe. But we're being realists due to axiom 1, right? We want to say that your mind does make a behavior difference. So that means there must be a material difference. Yet, we can't make sense of it because the cause of it is unobservable. So the signature of your mind making a difference to your behavior is basically noise. It's unexplained variability. It's entropy. Okay? That's what it means here in terms of unintelligible material events. And as we will see, there's a whole body of work already in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience using entropy measures for tracking cognitive activity. It's a useful tool already, except that people don't have a priori reasons for interpreting why this is a good tool for tracking these things. Now, for conscious experience, I think this is kind of intuitive, right? So you know, there's a factor making a difference in your behavior, which is, let's say, your goals, which is unobservable at the level of the neurophysiology, so it becomes a hidden variable, okay? So your signal becomes less predictable. Kind of intuitive. But the other side, it's a bit harder to get our heads around. We've got something, again, that's unobservable, which is, you know, there's a change in your conscious experience. But now it's the other way around. Something's happening, let's say, in your brain, which is causing this change in your experience. But we can't measure experience directly in your brain. So it's like we have a cause without an effect. It's weird. And I call that absorption in contrast to erosion. But it's basically the spontaneous or unexplained reduction in variability in the brain would be the signature of making a difference to your experience. So then putting everything together, basically we're proposing there's a black box. So instead of trying to eradicate the differences between the mind and body and identifying them directly, we just accept, as we saw several people say, that it's unintelligible to translate one to the other. Something gets lost in translation, and we don't understand why. But we can work with that. Okay? Natural sciences are very good working with unobservables that make a difference. In fact, that's what we do most of the time, right? We don't directly measure things. We don't understand exactly what's there. We create models of it, and then we use that to predict things. And then when it predicts well, we say, yeah, we got to figure it out. But we never directly observe it, okay? And that's what's proposed here. And we have two directions. We can go from the mind to the material basis, making a difference, mental causation, efficacy. That's what I call eruption. There's a creation of information happening here that can't be reduced to material flows. Time series will become, harder to predict. And on the other side, there's a reduction in variability unexpectedly, which creates an eruption on the side of your experience, which it turns out, nicely so, that phenomenologists who study this from the side of the first person experience already use the word eruption to talk about how the body breaks into your stream of consciousness. And it usually does that affectively. You feel it first. Something changes in the tonality of your experience. Something is, you might not quite understand exactly what's going on, but you feel a change. So that's the kind of axis that they would describe from that side. And interesting enough, also for the side of absorption, I didn't talk about it in this talk because it's about the natural sciences, but phenomenology also has a notion of absorption already. They call it absorbed coping, which is that if you're very much engaged in a task, famous example is hammering. You're hammering. That's almost mindless activity. Okay, there's a reduction in your awareness, and you kind of get lost in the activity, in the flow of your agency. That's what they call absorbed coping, and it kind of fits also with this idea. So that's the theoretical framework. I think that's, it's kind of neat, but really, the test of it will be, does it give us a better understanding of the empirical literature? And so I'm just going to finish by highlighting a few studies. And it's interesting because this is ongoing work. This just came out, I don't know, a few days ago. Okay, but I get emails and people send me stuff and I say, wow, I didn't know this, but now it makes sense, right? So I'm going to show you a few of those. First, something that has been already in discussion for a long time is that for psychedelics, and the interest here comes from psychedelic therapy of major depressive disorder. It turns out to be a very good treatment for some people. People asking why? Why are psychedelics, a good treatment for otherwise untreatable depression? But so when we look at what happens in the brain during the psychedelic state, it seems to increase the complexity of neural activity. Higher state spaces, more unpredictable, more neural entropy, however you want to measure this. Okay. Most of the time, this has been interpreted as tracking the level of awareness. Okay, so just going back to this diagram, as if you're talking about the right-hand side, right? Something is happening in your experience. It's changing the level of awareness. But this theory would actually predict the opposite. Okay, so if entropy goes up, it seems like we should be on the left-hand side. Something is erupting into the brain. So what's going on here? There seems to be a confound somewhere. And the reason is that these studies don't differentiate between agency and subjectivity, going back to this original slide. Well, if you're in a psychedelic state, you've got different, more richer maybe, experiences, but you're definitely also going to be cognitively under a lot of more loads than normal. Okay, you're going to be more responsive to things. You're going to behave differently. You're going to be on unfamiliar territory. Maybe you're going to have a panic attack, whatever. So there's a lot of things also happening on the left-hand side of your mind, making a difference to how you behave. And so then someone sent me this paper saying, by the way, seems like you're on the right track. And this is a very strange study. People were supposed to do cognitive tasks while they're falling unconscious. Okay, so you're giving them anesthesia, general anesthesia, and you're sitting on the computer trying to do a task while you're like slowly passing out. Okay, I don't know how they passed ethics with this. Well, they're from the Department of Anesthesiology, so I guess that's why. But here's the interesting finding, and it was unexpected, that of course you might think that as you're getting under propofol anesthesia, your brain complexity goes down. This is in line with what people were thinking, right? So it's the other direction. Psychedelic pushes you up in terms of entropy. Anesthesia pushes you down in terms of entropy. Except that for the people who actually managed to hold on and continue performing the task quite well while they were falling unconscious, the results are the opposite. You get them having higher levels of entropy than even for baseline. Now, two possible explanations. Somehow they actually had an elevated state of consciousness, which is unlikely because they were falling unconscious. Or when we're picking up entropy in the brain, what we're really picking up is cognitive effort, which is much more in line with the theory that I was proposing. So interesting, right? Little pieces of evidence that fit quite neatly with the framework. Another paper, we were recently visited by Giovanni Rabuffo, and he pointed this work to me. They're looking at traveling waves in the brain, neural activity, and their proposal is that the brain is actually organized in two different modes. Sometimes in a transient, and sometimes it falls into an attractor. And the consciousness for them is at the points where it falls into the attractor, and things become integrated. That's very interesting because integration is, to some extent, absorption. It's a reduction of variability. Okay, so it fits again with the framework that I just presented, but here it's based on neurophysiological evidence, looking at when do people are aware of stimulus, when can they report them, and so on. But again, the idea is that when you're in a transient, you're less likely to be aware of things, and when you fall into a state of absorbed variability, you're more likely to be able to experience things. And going back to a classic work by Varela's group, the originator of anarchism from back in the 90s, this is when they first proposed large-scale neural synchrony as a signature of conscious awareness. What they did is they had people look at these kind of moony faces, and in some cases it's easy to see the face, and in the other it's kind of meaningless, and you have to press a button saying, did you see the face or not? For the conditions where you have people seeing the face, this is what happens in terms of large-scale face synchrony in their brain. Okay, we've got stimulus onset. P is for the perception condition, which is this one, the face. There's a dip in synchrony, and then it goes up and becomes significant around 200 to 300 milliseconds, which is indeed the moment when people become aware of the stimulus, when they report, yeah, I see the face. Right? So increased redundancy in terms of information, things become synchronous, associated with the emergence of conscious awareness. But what they don't really talk about is this massive dip and this dip here, which point in the opposite direction. Like, what's going on there? Why is there desynchronization? Well, we can talk about that in terms of eruption, right? It seems like there's a preparatory poisonous of the system, getting ready to become aware, and then getting ready to press the button. Okay, so we can actually look at both sides. Now we have a story to say, when I'm measuring your brain and I just measure this synchrony over time, I can already make a prediction, even if I don't know what you experience, that when you're above baseline in terms of synchrony, probably you had more experience, you're more aware of something. And when you're below this line, probably you were doing something. It's a very broad categorization that comes out of this. You can do this from a priori principles. So then for the absorption, another paper that someone just sent to me over email 2 days ago, turns out that it's already known in neuroscience that stimulus onset, which basically means you're perceiving something, quenches neural variability, and that it's a widespread phenomenon. So people apparently already know this already. It's absorption, right? So absorption of variability in neural response is widely associated with the onset of perception. But they don't have an a priori argument. It's data-driven, right? Hey, we found this interesting correlation. That's nice. But we can give an a priori argument for why we should expect to find this. Now, what about free will debate and so on? Here's a very nice paper, highly recommended, on what is the readiness potential. So readiness potential is maybe the most important finding in the arsenal of people who want to argue against free will. Okay, so in the experiment, you're told, press your finger, like, the button when you feel the urge to do so freely. Then you record brain activity, and then if you go from when you pressed backwards in time, you find that there's this buildup of potential in your brain, which seems to suggest that I could have already predicted when you're going to press the button way ahead of when you thought you were going to press the button. No free will. Your brain did it, right? So in this paper, what they do very nicely is they say, well, this is kind of unfair because you're going back from when you know they pressed the button. What if we instead start from the beginning of the trial and then try to predict when they're going to press the button? Turns out it's pretty much impossible. You got a Brownian random walk through state space, and at some point, there's a little blip, a fluctuation, that then crosses the threshold for motor activation, and you press the button. It's a very short time frame. And so their interpretation of this is that theorists who want to identify the source of action as the agent will have to tell a story that somehow makes a case for the noisy trigger being part of or attributable to the agent. And I hope I've shown you that with interruption theory, that's exactly what we can do. Right? We've got good a priori reasons for thinking that noisy trigger is exactly the way in which the mind expresses itself at the level of neurophysiology. All right, last couple of slides, going back to things that are happening in our lab. Something I haven't talked about today, but which will be the topic for tomorrow, so I'm just setting up tomorrow's seminar to speak. We're doing a lot of EEG hyperscanning because we want to understand how do people connect with each other? How do we share experiences? You know, how are we, as a we, together in this auditorium, right? Not just I, you, but really as a shared experience. It turns out that our main hypothesis for that, which is large-scale neural synchrony in the style of Varela that I showed you, as a basis for shared experience, is complexified by the new framework that we're developing. Because when we do things together, okay, so here's, let's say, a resting state. We're recording both brains independently, and then we can look at spurious correlations between them. Okay, now they're both engaged in a joint task. Let's say, you know, grabbing things. You know, I grab a bottle, you grab a bottle, so on. So we're doing things together, but independently so. We might expect some increased synchrony across the brains. But we have to be careful because now they're also regulating their coupling with respect to the environment. So mental causation is also going to come in and create some interference, right? Now, what happens if they're actually co-regulating their interaction? So that the success of my action now depends on what you do complementarily, like giving something, right? I cannot give this pointer if there's nobody taking it. It's like, no, there's nobody here, right? So there are some actions where the success of the action depends on someone else coming in and helping you. That's this situation. And that means that your involvement, your mental causation, so to speak, is no longer only self-dependent, but also other-dependent, which means we might expect even more interference at the level of individual brains. So it turns out that maybe our expectation needs to be revised, that instead of finding ever more increased large-scale neural synchrony across brains, we might expect less synchrony across brains, which, if true, would turn the entire field of hyperscanning on its head because everybody's searching for interbrain synchrony. And just to give you a sneak peek, you know, don't replicate this, is not published, okay, this is totally preliminary, but just the kind of thing that we're looking at. So we've got the two brains looking at some of the regions, and we can compare when people are engaged in a social task compared to when they're in the rest. And with strict statistical conditions, we don't really find much difference, actually. Nothing significant remains, except in the higher frequency ranges. But then what's the most dominant effect is the blue one, which is desynchronization. The brains become more different from each other. Except for in the high gamma, the red points here, there are some areas which become more synchronized. Now, with the framework that we've developed, maybe you can already have an expectation of what these different frequency bands might relate to. We might argue that this high gamma here is related to their shared experience that they're creating, whereas this, low gamma and beta, might be related with their joint action in separate agency and subjectivity, maybe even in terms of EEG frequency bands, which is nice because for a lot of people, high gamma is actually the frequency band for looking for the signature of consciousness already, previously in the literature. All right, so let me just wrap up. Thank, again, the sponsors, which is this project here about One World, One Health, trying to integrate across the disciplines, and also thanks to all the team at OIST, which make all this work possible. And thank you for your attention.